what exactly is a hook mean, and how do you develop a hook in a sense that is consistent with the truth, okay, and it's ethical in all ways, but also is sexy and exciting and makes people want to listen and tune in and read more. So tell us, how you go about when you look at somebody. Again, I'm not a good example. There's a couple of hooks in there that were, pretty easy to latch onto. But give me an example. How about this? Let's use real world examples.
Yep.
Give me an example of some people who you've built. I know you've had a lot of these people you've built into major brands and celebrities, but that really started off with just what you would think would be very little, yet you somehow took that and redirected it and blew it up accordingly. So tell me how you do that. Give me one example.
Well, we're fortunate enough to manage a lot of high-end brands that a lot of them I haven't really built myself, but there's another one which we'll get onto a bit later, a television project which we're working on. But in terms of, I take a great example of a client of ours, Glenn Boss, who is a jockey in Australia.
Okay.
And the most prestigious race, like the Kentucky Derby here, is the Melbourne Cup.
Right.
So the first time I met Glenn, he'd won Melbourne Cup. And obviously for him, they say it's the race that stops a nation. It's the sport of kings. So there's fantastic sponsors linked to it. But what I did with Glenn is I tried to build a business around him, around his brand. So instead of just him being a jockey, he then became a brand ambassador for Emirates. He then wrote newspaper columns. He then became a commentator on Channel 7. So I, in fact, tried to build a business around him. So not just a jockey. All of a sudden, he became a journalist as well. He became a commentator, a writer for newspapers, News Limited newspapers. So I think that's I don't have probably the best example because we do look after high-end people, but to build a brand, build a business around their name.
So essentially, I think what you're saying is that a jockey alone, well, yeah, it's a great story in a sense to win, the Melbourne Cup. I get that. I know people in Melbourne are crazy for pretty much any sport, right? Melbourne's like, they love sports in Melbourne, right? And I know I've actually coached some sporting teams there that you, in fact, hooked me up with the Melbourne Storm for one, right? Now we're doing the same thing in South Africa with the South African rugby team, right? Yeah. But I think what you're saying is that the jockey story, well, that's okay. But what you did is you kind of took that and then you turned it into where all of a sudden he becomes a journalist. He becomes an expert in
television presenter,
right?
Public speaker, and he had a fantastic story. Couldn't communicate it the best, but he wanted to learn, and now he's a brilliant speaker. And so, trying to build that brand, a business around his brand, so he's just not a jockey. He then did go the next 2 years, went on to win the Melbourne Cup 2 more times, which did help the brand a lot more. But that's probably a rough example of what I try to do. Instead of just taking someone and they're successful in one field, taking that and to grow it into other areas as well to help continue building the brand and the profile.
Okay, so in that case, so what if you had to say what his hook clearly was that he was a world-class jockey and he won
famous race.
Okay,
that was his hook.
Right. Now, give me an example of like, for instance, I'll give you one myself. I know one of your clients. I've seen some of his work. Was the guy who does these mega wave surfing, where they actually get towed into storms off of the coast of Tasmania and surf like 80-foot waves. What's his name? The guy?
Ross Clark-Jones and Tom Carroll. And
they're your clients, correct?
That's correct. And Ross is the sort of the granddaddy of big wave surfing. Tom Carroll, two-time world champion surfer. So taking surfing away from the mainstream surfing audience into a much broader audience, into cinemas and Discovery channels and everything else, that they decided that they just wanted to chase big waves around the world. So they went to Japan and surfed typhoons, and visually on big screen, it's incredible. Mm-hmm. But for me, taking a former world champion surfer and a former professional surfer is on the tour now chasing big waves, taking them into the mainstream. They're international ambassadors for Quicksilver, Red Bull, Discovery Channel signed their show Storm Surfers internationally. So we're still part of the process with these guys, but it's not hard to sell visually because it's so incredible watching two guys surf.
So in that case, essentially, they had the germ of the backstory there.
Correct.
But they weren't really leveraging that and taking
they were leveraging it in terms of the surfing industry and surfing media and everything else. But how do you then take that out of that industry?
Very defined niche, right?
And take it to the broader market. That was the challenge, and that's what Storm Surfers through Discovery Channel has done for them, and we're continuing to doing more things now of endorsements and other things. So we're building their brand, their Storm Surfers brand, and it's quite incredible to watch these guys.
Okay. Now give me an example, for instance, of somebody, and in fact, I'm going to leave the name out for privacy's sake. But for instance, you and I have a mate that we share, a mutual friend of ours, who's a speaker, and who is not a celebrity at all. And he's a very competent speaker and a very effective speaker, and has great content. But he has never had any really, any articles that are meaningful written about him. And I know he came to you, and as a favor, you sort of laid out a framework for him.
Correct.
In terms of how he would get started from scratch. A guy that has the content, and his backstory is really just, it's almost, I guess you could call it typical, the backstory itself, that he's a guy that, doesn't come from a wealthy family, right? Didn't distinguish himself in college in any particular, any sporting event in any way, right? But yet somehow, throughout his 35 years of life, he managed to come up with some really, really empowering distinctions that he can share with other people and help them become successful, right? So that's what he does. He goes out and he coaches businessmen, he coaches young entrepreneurs and helps them, achieve wealth and success. Yeah. Good friend of mine. But the question really is that as good as his message might be, the core of it might be, the challenge he was facing is that no one really knows about it.
Correct.
So what was the first thing you told him to do? What was his step
Well,
one?
the main thing, that he had a lot of content. He had a lot of video content of him presenting at seminars, his own seminars here and around the world. When I checked him out on YouTube, there was one pretty crappy video on there.
Right.
And I asked him, I said, well, you have all this content, why don't you put it up onto YouTube? So he started doing that. When I dug through his material a little bit further, he had been on television before. He had been on Sky News in Australia. They had asked him on as a guest commentator one time. So I said, why not have that on YouTube? So we started to build a presence. And because his primary job is a speaker and an educator and a communicator, that to get his content that he had and put it to a place that's accessible for other people. Not just his own website, but somewhere like YouTube.
Right.
And to start building his brand, of which there's still a little way to go. But at least those first few steps of building a presence,
right.
A presence online.
Okay, so basically, so that was the first phase of this, was to actually get this person and have them corral all their assets they had, meaning the videotape they already had, any testimonials, any stray PR, which they already had some that came in almost by accident, right? And to almost corral that into one spot on YouTube, so when people go and search for them, a lot of stuff starts popping up, and they start to get that perception of being, more, I wouldn't say important, just more substantial in the eyes of the media, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And now the next step, which is with the phase you're in right now with him, I know, is exactly what are you doing right now?
Well, the next phase of building this profile is looking for opportunities. And as we know, Person X is a great communicator, very energetic, and has a point of difference to a lot of other people. He's very successful at what he does. So it's looking for opportunities now. And I've often said that with the forever changing media landscape, that wages are coming down in terms of radio. Newspapers are struggling to find ways of making money online. So having an opportunity to contribute to media outlets, so have a weekly spot on a radio show, eventually possibly get your own radio show, but to build a media presence, and that's the phase we're working on now. And so when people look at him as a reference point on YouTube, and they can click on and see 55 videos on YouTube, well, that then becomes, it has an instant profile, basically.
Right, and then you essentially use that to approach traditional media, whether
Correct.
it's radio,
Correct.
TV, right?
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And because the content that he talks on and the topics he talks on, he's obviously an expert in his field of what he does, and he's very good at it. So I don't think it's going to be too difficult. And just recently, he's speaking at a major event with Richard Branson and Tony Robbins. So
right.
His profile is building.
Okay, awesome. So now, just to understand this idea of the hook, just one more time, I want to just delve into it a little bit deeper.